So I'm reading The End of Your World by Adyashanti, and this is the beginning of chapter 3. And it's entitled, I Got It, I Lost It. There's a metaphor that I like to use to describe the journey from non-abiding to abiding awakening, that of a rocket ship. A rocket ship takes a tremendous amount of thrust and a tremendous amount of energy, both to get off the ground and then to break the gravitational field as it travels through the sky and ultimately into space. If there is enough fuel in the rocket and it gets far enough away from the Earth, it can eventually get beyond the gravitational field of the planet. Once the rocket is beyond the gravitational field of the Earth no longer has the power to pull it back down. As a metaphor, we can think of the egoic structure, or what I call the dream state, as the Earth. The dream state has a gravitational force. It has the tendency to pull consciousness into itself. This gravitational force is really what one is dealing with throughout the entirety of a spiritual journey. Awakening is breaking free of this gravitational force. Initially, it may simply be leaving the dream state, awakening from the dream state of me, and separation and isolation. But because we've awakened does not mean that consciousness has gotten past the gravitational pull of the dream state. If we haven't gone completely beyond this gravitational field, we're going to be pulled back towards the experience of me and the perception of separateness. This gives rise to what I call the I got it, I lost it phenomenon. People report having amazing realizations about the truth, but then the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year, they feel they've lost it. It's like a rocket ship that left the ground, got a few miles up into the atmosphere, and then ran out of fuel. And now it's being pulled back towards the Earth. Using the metaphor of the rocket ship is a way of thinking about the process of awakening. The moment of awakening itself, going from the dream state to reality, isn't a process. It always happens spontaneously. But as I've said, the disillusion of the ego takes time. While the moment of awakening is instantaneous, there is a process that unfolds thereafter. The process of getting beyond the gravitational force of the dream state. The next section's entitled, I'm awake but. People come to me all the time and say, Adya, I'm awake but. Of course, as soon as they say but, I know as a teacher that they are not awake in this moment. They may have had a moment when they broke through the confines of duality and perceived truth, but they have not experienced an abiding awakening. They are not awake right now. In terms of awakening, all that matters is right here and right now. What happened yesterday does not really have much to do with what is happening today. The question isn't, have I had an awakening? The question is awakening awake right here and right now? When someone comes to me and says, Adya, I've had an awakening, the first thing I want to clarify with that person is whether or not the mind has already co-opted the awakening. Because if the person is saying, I as an ego, as a me, had an awakening, that is just another illusion. If it is a true awakening, we know that it is not the me that has awakened. Awakeness woke up from the me. Spirit woke up from the identification with ego. The ego does not awaken. The me does not awaken. We are not the ego. We are not the me. We are that which is awake to the ego and the me. We are that which is awake to the world, and we are the whole world as well, when seen from the true perspective. So as a teacher, I first want to find out if someone is claiming awakening from the standpoint of ego. Does the person really believe I, as a me, has awakened? Of course, in conventional language we use terms like I and me, so it's perfectly fine to use these kinds of words. Nonetheless, the first thing I try to clarify as a teacher, and the first thing I think everybody should clarify within themselves, is that it's not the me who has awakened. Awakeness woke up from the me. Or as I like to say sometimes, It's enlightenment that is enlightened. It's not the me that is enlightened. It is not the person that is enlightened. It is enlightenment that is enlightened. That may be hard to understand until one experiences it for oneself, but of course, all of spirituality is like that. Everything must be verified for and in oneself. This I got it, I lost it phenomenon is a struggle, as it were, between our true nature and our imagined sense of self. It means our consciousness is not yet beyond the gravitational field of the dream state of ego, and so we vacillate between our true nature and our imagined sense of self, back and forth, back and forth. This can be very disconcerting and can feel schizophrenic in a way. We've seen the deeper reality of things, and then we find ourselves back in the dream state. Part of us still knows the deeper reality. Part of us knows that this egoic structure isn't true. Part of us knows that whatever our minds believe, whatever the interpretation it is making, it is literally nothing but a dream, in the mind and the body. But the gravitational force of the dream state can still be very strong. Even as we know the truth of our being, we can still find ourselves believing in ego. While we may know that a thought has no validity, is absolutely untrue, we may find ourselves believing it anyway. Before we awakened, we either believed a thought or we didn't believe a thought. That's all we knew. It was one or the other. But after a glimpse of awakening, things can become very strange. We may believe a thought and not believe a thought simultaneously. We may act in a way that we know is coming from the undivided vision that we have seen. It is like we feel compelled by inner forces we don't understand to behave. It's like we feel compelled by inner forces we don't understand to behave in a way that we know is not true. There are many examples of this kind of experiences. If you recognize yourself in this phenomenon, I can only say that it is very common. That's not to say it isn't confusing. It often feels like you've made a great leap backward, that you have devolved. How can you believe a thought and not believe a thought at the same time? How can you be in a conversation with somebody saying things that are coming from ego, knowing where they're coming from, but saying them anyway? This is very disconcerting. At this point, a lot of people will assume that somehow they have made a mistake, that something's gone terribly wrong. But what is important to know is that nothing has gone wrong. No mistake has been made. This is just the next phase in one's awakening. It is the next unfolding. As I have said, it's rare when someone's initial awakening ends up in abiding awakening. It happens, but not nearly as often as the other kind of awakening, in which our realization vacillates. Some teachers would say that if awakening vacillates, then it is not true awakening. I'm not one of them, for reasons that I've already described. If we have seen the truth, we have seen the truth, whether we've seen it for 2 seconds or 2,000 or for 2,000 years. It's the same truth. With awakening, the stakes go up. What do you do at this particular phase, during which awakening vacillates, turns on and off like a light switch that somebody's flipping back and forth and over, which you have no control? First, you start to understand that nothing has gone wrong, that this is the next leg of your journey. If you run from this experience, if you try to solve this dilemma by running back and searching for that awake place, then you're avoiding this part of the journey. Once you realize that there's no problem here, you'll see that there may still be some confusion and some pain, but it's okay. Vacillation can be very painful. In fact, it is much more painful to act in a way that we know is not true once we've seen that it is not true. Before, we may have acted in ways that were based in untruth, but we didn't know it. We were totally in the dream state. As Jesus said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." When we are in the dream state, we do not know what we are doing. We are simply acting out our deep programming. But once we've seen the true nature of things, once Spirit has opened its eyes within us, we suddenly know what we're doing. There's a much more accurate sense of whether we're moving or speaking or even thinking from truth or not. When we act from a place of untruth anyway, in spite of our knowing, it's much more painful than when we didn't know our actions were untrue. When we say something to someone that we know is untrue, it causes an inner division that is vastly more painful than when we said the same thing and thought it was true. So, with awakening, the stakes go up. The more awake we get, the higher the stakes get. I remember when I was staying in a Buddhist monastery for a while. The abbess there, a wonderful woman, talked about this process of awakening as climbing a ladder. With each step you go, you have less and less tendency to look down. You have less tendency to act in ways you know aren't true, or to speak in ways you know aren't true, or do things you know aren't coming from truth. You start to realize that the consequences have become greater. The more awake we get, the greater the consequences are. Finally, the consequences of acting outside of truth become immense. The slightest action or behavior that's not in accordance with the truth can be unbearable to us. This type of responsibility is not something we count on when we imagine awakening. We think that awakening will give us a get out of jail free card. Initially, we have a relationship with the spiritual freedom of awakening that is infantile. We think that freedom is a personal thing, that it is about feeling extraordinarily good and free. But freedom is much more nuanced than that. It is not a personal thing. It is not an acquisition for us. As we become more conscious, we begin to see that there are consequences. There are consequences to everything, and they get bigger and bigger the more we behave in ways that are not in harmony with the way we know is true. This is actually a wonderful thing. It is what I call fierce grace. It is not soft grace. It is not the kind of grace that is beautiful and uplifting, but it is grace nonetheless. We know that when we act from what is not true, we will only be causing ourselves pain. That knowing is grace. Reality is always true to itself. When you're in harmony with it, you experience bliss. As soon as you are not in harmony with it, you experience pain. This is the law of the universe. It is the way things are. Nobody gets out of this law. To me, this knowledge is a grace. Reality is consistent. Argue with it, go against it, and it will hurt every single time. It will hurt you, it will hurt others, and it will contribute to the general conflict of all beings. But this fierceness is also beautiful. It helps orient us deeper and deeper into our true nature. We realize that to behave from any place other than our true nature is destructive to ourselves and just as important to the world and others around us. The more we understand this, the more often we are able to right ourselves when we get off course. The momentum of our conditioning. So why then does awakening vacillate? It mostly has to do with our conditioning. There are areas within ourselves that are so conditioned that at first not even awakening is able to penetrate them. As such, we haven't become totally free. Another word for conditioning is karma. Karma is a word that comes from the East. Without going into any esoteric meanings or explanations, means cause and effect. It refers to the conditioning we've received from our life experiences, the things we are predisposed to like or not like, based on our past experience. Our conditioning is in large part derived from our family of origin, the life we have lived, the situations we've brought into, and life experiences we've had. Parents and society condition our bodies and minds with their views, beliefs, morals, and norms. In this way, we are conditioned to like certain things and not others, to want certain situations to arise and not others, to pursue fame or wealth or money or spirituality or love. All of these things go into our conditioning. It's a bit like a computer program. If you had a computer and you load a program onto it, you are conditioning the computer to behave in a particular way. This is really what conditioning in a human being is like. Through the life circumstances and upbringing and all the rest, the human being is conditioned or programmed to behave in certain ways. You'll notice that if you get to know somebody well, if you become their great friend or lover or mate, you also get to know their conditioning. Because of this, you can predict with great accuracy how they will react in a given circumstance, what they will want, what they won't want, what they will tend to avoid, and what they tend to move toward. Once we get to know one another's conditioning, behaviour becomes very predictable. Most human beings derive their entire sense of self from their conditioning. They are literally conditioned, told and taught who they are. If you're good, if you're bad, if you're worthy or unworthy, if you're lovable or unlovable, all this is conditioning, and all this creates a false sense of self. In the same way, we are conditioned to view the world in a certain way. We are taught to see the world through certain eyes. Some people think the world is a wonderful place. Some people think it's a threatening place. Some people are prone to have a liberal point of view, some a more conservative point of view. All of this is part of the conditioning of the body and the mind, and all of this goes into the construction of a dualistic view of life and a dualistic view of the self. This dualism is what I mean when I talk about conditioning. At the moment of a real awakening, however, spirit or consciousness is liberated from this conditioning. It suddenly wakes up from its own conditioned self, as if waking up from a dream. Only when we have awakened from this conditioned illusory self do we know the incredible weight and burden that such conditioning is. At the moment of awakening, and maybe for quite some time afterward, the sense that conditioning could ever arise or become problematic again is completely foreign. This is one of the hallmarks of the awakened state. The sense that one could never again identify with the conditioned self. It seems unimaginable that we would ever go into a state of separation again. That sense of finality is inherent within the state of wakefulness. Yet the vast majority of people who experience awakening will, at some point, find their conditioning arising again. Of course, awakening blows out a tremendous amount of conditioning. It literally blows it out the system. But everybody's different as far as how much is blown out the system. For some people, 10% of their conditioning will get blown out. For others, it will be 90%. For still others, it will be somewhere in between. It's hard to say why awakening affects one person's conditioning one way and another person's another way. I could make speculations and get into metaphysical discussions about what might be going on, but ultimately the why doesn't matter. Either way, we are dealing with what we are dealing with. It's apparent that each being has a different sort of karmic inheritance. Each person has a different karmic load that he or she carries, and it does no good to complain about your karmic load, whether you perceive it to be greater or lesser than somebody else's. It is what it is. Karmic load actually doesn't have much to do with whether we can awaken, but it may have something to do with what happens right after the moment of awakening. Asking the right question. When a person's awakening vacillates, he or she often asks me, how do I stay in the awakened state? That is asking the wrong question. In spirituality, it is important that we ask the right questions. To wonder how to stay in the awakened state is a totally reasonable thing to do, but the question itself is ridiculous. It just makes no sense. Coming from the true nature of things, what makes more sense is to ask, how you unenlighten yourself? What is still held on to? What is still confusing? What situations in life can you get to believe things that aren't true and cause you to go into contraction, suffering, and separation? What is it specifically that has the power to entice consciousness back into the gravitational field of the dream state? We should not ask, how do I stay awake? Instead, we should ask, how is it that I'm unenlightening myself? How is it specifically that I'm putting myself back in an illusion? There is no one answer to this question. There is no one reason. There is no one way that people do it. People are pulled back by a gravitational force of the dream state for many reasons. Unconsciousness, assumptions, and belief patterns that are still operating. Unconscious conflicts that somehow survived the explosive nature of awakening and reconstituted themselves, various forms of conditioning. The process here becomes one of coming into right relationship with yourself and looking deeply at what it is that causes you to go back into the trance of separation. You need to start pinpointing the particular ways, the particular thoughts, the particular beliefs that put you back to sleep. This phase of the unfolding after awakening is not so much about rarefied spiritual practices. A lot of the conditioning that surfaces in our being is brought up in the rumble and tumble of existence. We are in relationship with situations and people, interacting with lovers and friends and children and all the rest. It is this gritty fabric of life where the spiritual rubber hits the road. What is required is the willingness to let life impact you, to let yourself see when life impacts you, to see if you go into any sort of separation about it, if you go into judgment, if you go into blame, if you go into should or shouldn't, if you start to point the finger somewhere other than yourself. It's coming to grips with the fact that the only person who can cause us to suffer, who can cause us to misperceive illusion and separation, who has this much power, is us. Nothing in the exterior environment causes us to lose a sense of the awakened state. Nobody we meet, no situation we deal with has the power to cause us to fall out of our awakening. This is one of the most important realizations we can make. It's all an inside job. It's all something we do to ourselves, mistakenly, unknowingly, and oftentimes unconsciously. So the difference here is that we've really awakened. We have a much less personal relationship with all this remaining karmic conditioning. It says, so the difference here is that if we've really awakened, we have a much less personal relationship with all this remaining karmic conditioning. Before awakening, our own conditioning was viewed as extraordinarily personal. Our conditioning defined us. We derived a sense of self from our conditioning, from our false sense, from our beliefs, from our opinions and desires, and all the rest. Before awakening, we were enmeshed in the dream state, and the dream state defined us. Once awakening has happened, if it is real, if it is authentic, we realize that even if illusions persist, they're not personal, and they don't define us. This is our greatest advantage. It's much easier to work with something if your sense of self is not being defined by it. It is much less frightening. Once there is the perception, from the awakened state, of one's own karma being impersonal, not having to do with any self, any body, any person, one's situation is much more workable. We understand that what we are experiencing is illusory, that it has to do with a momentum of misunderstanding. It's as if you're in a car barreling down the highway, and all of a sudden you pick your foot up off the accelerator. The moment your foot comes off is a metaphor for awakening. Oh my God, this car doesn't define me. Riding in this car doesn't define me. My foot on the accelerator doesn't define me. Where this car is going doesn't define me. This environment that it's traveling through doesn't define me. None of this has anything to do with who or what I am. That is what awakening reveals. When we awaken, we are no longer fueling the trance of separation. We are no longer pumping energy into it. But even if you never put your foot back on the accelerator, the car still has momentum, karmic momentum. It doesn't immediately come to a stop in most cases. It has a diminishing momentum that slows down over time. That said, we can also add energy to the existing momentum. We have to watch and discover when it is that we hop back in and put our foot back on the accelerator. Every time we re-identify with conditioning or karma, every time we believe a thought, we are putting energy back into the dream state, putting our foot back on the accelerator. So the process after awakening involves learning how to keep your foot off the gas and recognizing what puts your foot back on. Even though it's not personal, even though re-identification is totally spontaneous and it's not happening to anybody and it's not anybody's fault, We still need to investigate how it happens. In this, life itself is your greatest ally. As I've said, life is where the spiritual rubber hits the road. Life will show us where we are not clear. Being in relationship with life and others shows us clearly where we can still get hung up. If we have true sincerity, we are not going to hide in the memory of an awakened state. We are not going to hide in the realization of the Absolute. We are going to come out of hiding. We are not going to grab on to anything. What I'm getting at is that it is totally natural to seemingly be awake one moment and then seemingly be asleep the next. It is natural to feel like you have lost some of the realization you had last week or last month or last year. The most important thing is to know that it is natural. Nothing has gone wrong. Everything has just gone into a deeper level. Your entire system is being dredged clean in a deeper way. You are now capable of seeing yourself in a clearer light, and you are capable of seeing your tendency to go into separation in a more vivid way. You are seeing things that were unconscious before. They drove you without you having any real understanding of what was going on, but now you can start to see what was not conscious before. This allowing everything to become more and more conscious is a big part of the process that occurs after awakening. I'm going to stop there. So we're halfway through chapter 3. We'll pick it up.